Agreed to. I call the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it's always a great pleasure to be able to rise in this place on behalf of the people of Goldstein, and in particular in support of this bill. And I don't doubt for a second the people of Goldstein have a basic expectation that those who seek to represent others in the union might be law-abiding citizens in their tasks and duties, and as a consequence would support this bill. But, Deputy Speaker, we have just heard, and we always enjoy the how would you put it? I'll be charitable and say speeches of the Shadow Attorney General. And what we saw live was what we have been seeing since the election. And I don't say this with any sense of joy, it's a sadness, is the opposition's enlivenment of the 7 stages of grief. Of course, immediately after the election we had shock and disbelief at their defeat, and that they wouldn't be able to go on and do the opposite of what this bill seeks to achieve, to enlarge the space for their mates in the unions and paymasters in their unions to do and see as they wish on any industrial or work site around the country. Then we had a denial about the basis in which they lost the election and what that was driven by. So their solution to this denial was to select the current leader of the opposition to lead them, rather than reflect on their dilemma and why they have been did not attract the votes of the Australian people. Then, of course, we had guilt, and we saw that yesterday from the former leader of the opposition, who talked about his disappointment, the very, very disappointment that he had that he wasn't serving on this side of the chamber and able to lead his team to victory, to be able to do the exact opposite of what this legislation seeks to achieve. We then, of course, have seen things like anger and bargaining, and we saw that particularly with the allocation of the shadow ministry, where people were included or excluded, proportionate based on their rage at who was responsible for what, and of course the chief victim of that being not just the former leader of the opposition but also the former shadow treasurer. We've seen depression, loneliness and reflection, and we saw that specifically through their complete incapacity to be able to deal with basic issues like tax cuts, where apparently prior to the election $387 billion in tax cuts, and today they're saying we're not doing enough. And then, of course, if you've just seen in the Shadow Attorney General's speech on this bill, the reconstruction, working through of the issues and trying to understand and find a meandering narrative about why it is. And it meandered, as the good member for Ryan has reminded me, about why they can rationalise turning a blind eye to the illegality of union officials, while concurrently lecturing others in this place about integrity. At some point, I'm sure the opposition will reach a moment of acceptance, having gone to those stages. And we're about to come up to a 5-week break within the parliamentary schedule where they may just do that. It's entirely possible, of course, Deputy Speaker, that they will go in the reverse direction and go back to things like denial, guilt, certainly anger and bargaining, and perhaps a reconstruction working through the issues that they face. And yes, as the member for Ryan, part of it will be, I'm sure, about blaming voters. Don't they understand how good they could have had it if only there were a change of government? Because apparently $387 billion of new taxes, ripping off the band-aids and the restrictions on those who seek to break the laws would somehow have ended up in a better outcome for the people of Australia. But the matter before us right now, Deputy Speaker, is a relatively simple piece of legislation in both its objective and its ambition and its concurrence with the values of most of the people of this country. The simple proposition that if you're a union official seeking to represent others in the industrial capacity, that somehow you may be expected to adhere to the law. And if you do not adhere to the law, there is a pathway for disqualification in exactly the same way we look at it for things like company directors who are custodians of other people's money in pursuit of opportunity, and that we want people to meet basic standards in the workplace. And we all know horrific stories, and tragically coming out far too frequently these days, where we have registered organisations, whether they be business organisations or the trade union movement, where people breach the trust of the people that they are there to represent. They use the weight and authority that they have to throw it around to do the wrong thing. And of course, a critical part of that is also around sometimes overstepping the mark on behalf of the people they represent in their engagement with employers, in breaking the law, in misallocating money and seeking to advance their own interests at the expense of those they're representing. Now, when that occurs, it is not just an issue of integrity, though it is. It is also a fundamental breach of trust. And the expectation that we have as a government is that whether you are in business, you are in a representative body or a union, that you have a basic expectation to those you represent to honour that trust. And if you don't, that there should be penalties, because it goes to the heart of your character and therefore your capacity to do your role. And that's why we support this piece of legislation on this side of the House. It's to elevate the basic expectation that's adhered to by so many others to the paymasters of the Australian Labor Party, and that's precisely why they oppose it. Because sitting behind the modern Labor Party is a patronage network which, once a bright light is shined upon, people are held to account, the question is asked in courts of law about conduct, that it turns a light not just on the trade union movement, though that's critically important, but on themselves. And once they see that light, and they see, yes, light is the greatest disinfectant, that there is a lot to disinfect on that side of the chamber. There is a lot to disinfect on the trade union movement. And what they do in pursuit of that is, of course, parade on the trust and trade on the trust of good, decent, hard-working Australians who empower them to represent their interests. And if those on the other side had any skerrick of integrity, they would support this piece of legislation. Now, I fully accept that many of them have traded their way through the system of the trade union movement to sit in this place and carry the trust of the Australian people and their communities in the parliament. They absolutely have. And I realise the uncomfortableness that must sit with many of them, including those who have their backs turned to us now, to shine that light. Because that relationship does not end once you enter in this place. Because those people who sit atop of the union movement, who do the wrong thing, continue to pull the purse strings, the membership strings and the factional strings. But at some point, leadership is actually about standing up and turning to their colleagues and saying, we may have got here, but our responsibility is to now do what is right. And that is the test that they are failing in their opposition to this bill. If you pass a basic benchmark of what will happen if this bill passes, will workers be worse off? No. They will be better off. Will the institutions of our democracy be worse off? No, they'll be better off. The only people who will be worse off are the people sitting on that side of this chamber and the trade union leaders who break the law. If that is the basis of their opposition to this legislation and trying to conflate other issues to the concerns of criminal and law breaking that occurs in this country, then it is no wonder that the Australian people kept them on that side of this chamber. Thank you, Deputy.